Now, in the aftermath of the 2020 election, when Donald Trump lost and his supporters falsely claimed voter fraud, many Republican states tightened their voting laws. One of those was Georgia, which has a large black population and is one of this year's closely watched swing states. In 2021, Georgia's state lawmakers enacted a series of measures which, among other things, made it illegal to hand out water to voters waiting in line. Critics say it's an example of voting restrictions which unfairly target minority communities. Christine Slaughter is an associate professor of political science at Boston University, where she studies black voting habits and inequality issues. She joins us tonight from Baltimore. Welcome to DW. The Georgia example I just cited was one of the most egregious we could find. What's the stated purpose of a restriction like this?
The restrictions that we have on voting, in theory, are to protect the sanctity of the democratic process here in the United States. So we want to ensure that folks who are voting and are participating with the electoral process are citizens and are registered and qualified to vote. However, when we take in context the history of voting restriction in the United States, we've seen that they haven't been applied equally and fairly across racial groups, including for African-American voters, for immigrant voters, for voters for whom English is not their first language. So in theory, they protect the ballot box, but in practice, we see they often restrict and harm different individuals who are looking to cast a ballot.
Right. And do we presume that these restrictions tend to be implemented by one side? Is this a Republican phenomenon or a Democratic legislatures doing this as well?
I think across both parties, it's particularly important that the electoral process is free and fair. However, if we look across different states where we see the proliferation of voting laws, restrictive voting laws, those tend to be in more conservative-leaning states. However, this is not the case across the United States, as some places that are heavily Democratic also have voting practices or restrictive voting laws in place. So it does vary, but it's important to keep in mind that it's not simply controlled by one side. This is something that occurs at the state level.
Right. And so it's like looking at this from outside, you sort of look at it and you think, well, how is this legal? Even if you say your stated object is to preserve the sanctity of the democratic process, handing out bottles of water on a hot day, one wonders how that would damage democracy.
Yeah, so the Georgia Senate Bill 1 was particularly egregious because, like you said, it targeted something as simple as handing out water and snacks on a hot day for folks waiting in line to vote. But it does vary in terms of the severity or the restrictiveness of the ballot. So initially, those laws may be put in place to protect interference with the electoral process, because going back years ago, we would notice, or historians have documented, that people would try to intimidate voters in line. So the thought behind the rule, or the thought behind the restriction, is that to not interact with people while they are waiting to vote. It's just in practice, it's something as simple as passing out snacks versus handing out literature or incorrect information to dissuade people from voting.
Right. And are there states that you have particular concerns about?
I think for many Americans, every state is something that has great concern. But if we think about which states, again, are the 7 battleground states in this election, Vice President Harris and also former President Trump have visited Georgia extensively within the past few weeks to mobilize voters in Georgia. And if we can call around the 2020 election, Georgia, President Trump at the time had called to try to change or make changes to the certification of the electoral process in Georgia. So I think rightfully so, there's a lot of attention on Georgia, especially because of the concentration of African-American voters in Fulton County and in other counties in Georgia that are hoping to deliver to or vote Democratic for President or Vice President Harris. My apologies,
Right.
a bit too excited about the race tomorrow. So it is places like Georgia. Also, there's been a lot of activity in Pennsylvania. That is a close state. Every state that there is a close margin, restrictive voting rules can certainly turn over the outcome in the election.
Right.
So these are all things I think everyone is paying attention to.
And so despite this, though, Georgia and other states have reported record turnout amongst early voters this year. Does this mean concerns about the new rules were exaggerated?
Oh, absolutely not. I think when we look at early turnout in Georgia, one, we know most African-American voters prefer voting on election day compared to early voting methods. So to see the enthusiasm to participate in the election before the election day, I think has been great to watch. But it's also, no, this is not to say that election day we can see a completely different crowd of voters, but also a completely different set of rules in place, or a completely different process. Let me not say rules, a completely different process of folks having to wait in line for those people who did not participate in the early voting, which ended yesterday. So just because we saw enthusiasm does not mean that barriers aren't present. It's just people chose to vote early as compared to potentially encountering longer lines on election day.
And do we see moves amongst black voters and people of colour to try and counter these efforts at suppression?
Right, absolutely. I think on the ground here in the United States, we've seen one large legacy civil rights organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We've seen the historic sororities and fraternities of the Divine Nine, particularly work to ensure that people have the resources. If they do encounter intimidation at the polls, there are numbers to call. There are folks volunteering to work as poll workers. There are lawyers that are organizing for what anticipated challenges people face. That folks have already thought through ways to aid voters on election day, particularly students across college campuses as well.
OK, thank you for that. Associate Professor Christine Slaughter from Boston University. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.